forget anything important. So meeting is being recorded, very nice. So today I've put together Branding for Creatives, a small guide to breaking the rules. And in addition to that wonderful introduction that Sophie and Rebecca gave me, here's a brief introduction of myself. My name is Kyla Rain. I'm a 20-year-old artist, entrepreneur, and events coordinator currently living in Los Angeles, but originally from San Diego, California. I'm the editor and co-founder of Pure Nowhere, which is an international music and culture magazine that I've been running for about the last 5 years. In addition to this, I'm also the creative outreach vice president for a music tech startup called Slingshot, and I do my own freelance work. And I've worked with companies like Converse, Beats by Dre, and a few artists such as Travis Barker, Kenny Hoopla, to name a few. And I also thought that it was important to emphasize in this presentation that I am not an expert, that branding and marketing and such is like, there's no one size fits all to everything. So these are just some personal tips that I found work for me and what I do, and that I really hope that you guys find them engaging and informational. Okay. So first, I wanted to start out with just emphasizing the differences between branding and marketing, because everything within entrepreneurship essentially comes down to branding and marketing. Well, branding is the act of crafting an identity for yourself, your company, your organization, however you choose to apply that. I think of this as like a Dr. Frankenstein kind of sense. Marketing is the act of how you communicate that to others. You can have the most amazing idea in the world, but no one will really know what the hell you're talking about if you don't communicate it right. So that's where marketing comes to play. So with this, I wanted to talk a bit about the rules and exceptions, because if we want to get technical about things, there are specific rules to branding. However, I don't really feel like this audience I don't feel like the audience that we have today is really one to play by the rules. So I wanted to talk more about branding in an abstract sense for people who want to create more than a business, but a community that's constantly evolving and growing together. And if you're interested in a by the books method of things, I'm sure you could Google and find a list of really amazing websites, but that's not exactly what we're going to talk about today. Beautiful. And so for the nature of preserving time, I'm just going to skip over the rules altogether and go down to the exceptions, which is you. And I think part of the main core of branding when it comes to the exceptions narrows down to 3 things: authenticity, consistency, and visual storytelling. And there's an asterisk next to consistency, because I feel like if part of your consistency is being inconsistent, then that bleeds into authenticity. You have to accept the fact that that's how you work as a creative, and you have to be very honest about that. And so each of these pillars blends into the other. Authenticity blends into consistency, consistency blends into visual storytelling, and visual storytelling is something that we'll dive a bit deeper into in future slides. Yes, beautiful. And so that brings us to the fun part, which is visual storytelling, which is a huge main core of when it comes to branding as a creative. Beautiful. And so there's a ton of different things that go into visual storytelling, but 2 of the main focuses that are really important to center in on are narrowing down a core ethos, which is essentially creating a creative mantra for yourself. What do you want to do? What do you value the most? What makes you excited and passionate and ready to take over? Because if you yourself don't truly believe in what you're doing, then how can you expect other people to? And then we go to mind mapping elements of inspiration. And this is essentially narrows down the building blocks of your brand. So this should be multidisciplinary, sensory, with sensory connotation, focusing on what elements of design do you resonate with, what items, places, people, experiences do you associate with the most, and deconstruct that. I feel like people kind of narrow themselves into a hole when mind mapping elements of inspiration for their brand, because it doesn't all have to be visual. And I feel like when creating a company, you should try to diversify as much influence as you're bringing in, because then you will get a wider range of people who identify with that. And with this, it's really important to not only have yourself in mind, but also have the audience that you are targeting as well. Like I said, you want to draw in a community of people who will support you no matter what you do, whether you're building a brand for yourself as a freelancer, you're doing something in terms of a publication like I do, or a small startup company, anything in the creative sphere, people will really identify with something that is genuine and passionate and descriptive, something that they can lose themselves in. And so with this, you are building a home, which is a super important thing to remember, especially in a creative area. Like it's not like a traditional like tech company where you're trying to sell people a product, or maybe you are selling people a product, but you want people to be more invested in more of who you are instead of what you're selling, because people really buy things for the company and not for the product, especially when it comes down to smaller companies and more honest creatives. And so I just wanted to show an example of this, of some things that we did for Pure Nowhere. So here are snippets that we took out of our first print issue. And so when narrowing down the branding just for the magazine in general, we tend to center ourselves around youth culture. So deconstructing that's interpreted so differently for so many people. So how do you take such a broad idea and narrow it down into one core area? And I think that really comes down to collective experience. And so with this, we wanted to, I guess, create a community and a publication that wasn't as polished and clean, and wasn't as, for lack of a better terms, professional. I wanted it to be something where people can hold it and feel like they know who made it. You know what I mean? It's not something that's unobtainable. It's something that you can throw in your bag and you don't get sad about if you maybe spill coffee or rip a page or something, because that's what it's meant for. And so for this, we really took elements of handwritten pieces. We wanted to draw a lot of inspiration from traditional analog photography. So even our digital photos that we included are a bit more rough and unedited. We have scanned journal pages. Most of our titles are handwritten. We have little finger painting bits. And if you look over here, it's another journal scan that I thought was very fun. But yeah, so that's just a bit of an example, I guess, of how you can take interdisciplinary elements, because we wanted to draw a lot of inspiration as well from like live music and concerts and the feelings that people get from those moments. And I think that really comes down to just figuring out what inspires you the most. Like, let's say you're super inspired by like lemons, I don't know, so you want to take those zesty elements of that specific fruit, and maybe you have bright colors of pop art or really bold like 60s type font, or maybe, I don't know, but you get the point. It can come from anywhere, and don't limit yourself to something that's purely a visual sense. And just remember that it's always okay to brand and rebrand. It's okay to change your mind, but always be unapologetic about that. And I feel like that's something that took us a long time to realize with Pure Nowhere, was that when we started out, we wanted to have one very distinct brand image and continue that throughout our whole time. And we've been around for almost 5 years now, which is a fairly long period of time for any publication. And I feel like through this, we've realized that the more you change and the more honest you are, and the more that you humanize your company and yourselves as individuals and not as a collective entity, is when people tend to empathize with you and people connect with that indecisiveness and that growth. And I always like to think about, can you truly outgrow something that grows with you? Which is where I think, in a more traditional branding sense, I feel like people would have an opposite opinion, where they feel like you should create one vision for your company and keep that consistent throughout time. But especially in a creative field, like I said, it's a guide to breaking the rules. So I feel like the more you change as an individual, just stay true to whatever you're doing in that sense, and rebrand, reimagine, figure out what works for you. And then that sort of just goes over a few of the main tips that I had on creative branding. I understand that was probably fairly quick, and I really hope that it made sense. But if you enjoyed it or have any additional questions, I put my contact information on here. And I believe we're also going to go into questions after this. So if there's anything you'd like to go more in depth on, just let me know.
Cool, yay, thank you, Kyla. That was awesome. Yeah, let's open this up to any questions. I'm just gonna start with one and then we can get into the audience. I would just love to know a little bit more about how you approach branding for projects when it's for either Pure Nowhere or for something that's been commissioned versus a project that is completely yours and you have all the creative freedom for it.
Yeah, of course. I feel like For a project that's going outside of what I want and including other individuals, I feel like it's really important to focus on collective input, because you're not only creating a product for yourself and purely for what you enjoy, what you love, but it's also going to be a part of somebody else. So with a lot of our shows, I do have a collaborator that I work with on that, and we also take feedback from some of the artists that are working on the show, some of just random team members that are helping us set up, if anybody has any input on how they envision the project going. And then for myself, I tend to look more introspective in that sense. Really just drawing out like what inspires me and what makes me passionate, because I feel like if you brand a project really well, you're going to want to work on that in such an intense capacity, and I think emphasizing that is really important.
Good. I guess going off of that too, when you're collaborating with other people, but you have a common goal in mind or look, how do you kind of balance that between, how do you balance everyone else's vision when you're collaborating with the vision as a whole?
Yeah, that's definitely something that I know I run into issues with sometimes, especially because I think valuing everybody's opinion is like a super, super important thing and should be a default as a creative. But when it comes down to it, you also have to recognize that the metaphor, like too many chefs spoil the soup or whatever, and recognizing that like if you are in charge of this project, then you have the final say of, okay, I love this idea, but maybe let's go in a different direction. And I think that also really comes down to communication and knowing how to communicate with people. Like let's say somebody has an amazing suggestion but isn't exactly quite the direction you want to go in, approach it with like a, yes, I love that, but what if we do this? And so finding ways to implement small elements of each individual, but maybe not necessarily changing the project as a whole, if that makes any sense.
Definitely. Thank you. Okay, looks like we have Ellis. Do you want to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask?
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much. I just started a zine, queer magazine. It's like definitely like for Black people, brown people, queer people together. But like we're in the starting stages, and I guess I wanted to know like what advice would you give someone or a zine that's like starting out that doesn't have too much original content, but how do you make sure that like um your content is like, or the content that you're finding, like whether that's Pinterest or whether that's like really like posting stuff, is still on brand, and like you make sure that your brand shows through even through like other people's work, you know?
Yeah, that's beautiful. Also, I would love it if you could send me a link to like your Instagram or your website or something.
First, thank you.
Of course, I'm really excited like at like all the new zines that are popping up lately. So that's beautiful, and I would definitely, I think in the beginning of Pure Nowhere, how, because that was one thing I sort of like struggled with too in the beginning. I'm like, okay, we don't have very much original content, so what can we do for this? And I think one of the main things that helped me the most was scrolling through Instagram and finding smaller creatives that I really resonated with, that I felt like, that also goes, going back to like the visual storytelling thing. One thing that I wanted to emphasize was that with visual storytelling, it's not always about where you're at, but where you want to be. And so when starting out a magazine, what I sort of did was I found smaller creatives that I felt really resonated with where I wanted to be as a publication. And so I reached out to them and started to create this community of contributors, which is really approachable if it's like a smaller photographer, graphic designer, something like that, where you're like, hey, I love your work. I would love to like feature you, or I would love to like repost this image with full credit. And credit is always one of the most important things when sharing other people's work as a publication. But yeah, because then that kills two birds with one stone. Then you have this imagery that gives you inspiration to move forward with your own branding. And you're also at the same time curating a community that you know will come back and support you. And if their image is the same as where you want to be, then you know that you resonate in that way, if that makes any sense.
No, that does. Thank you so much. I appreciate you.
Yeah.
Okay, next we have Lydia. You want to go ahead and unmute yourself?
Yeah, I was just wondering, so when you started your magazine, how do you kind of find like the branding that you felt resonated best with you? Because like I always think that, say personally, I've got quite a few different, say like interests and stuff like that. How did you figure out which one worked best for the message you were trying to portray?
Honestly, the biggest thing for me, because when I originally went into this, I was 15 years old. It took me like a year and a half to like even get the site to a place where I felt somewhat comfortable and like putting it out there as like, this is my magazine, this is Pure Nowhere. And it really just comes down to trial and error, especially if you have like a lot of different vision and interests and you're just starting out. And as young people as well, none of us really have like, well, I'm making an assumption here, but I'm assuming that none of us really have like industry professional like education and all that sort of thing. So trial and error is really like the best guide you can have with that. We honestly used to change and still do change the website like every other week, and it used to be very, very consistent where we found one element that we loved and maybe like a week later realized that like, oh, what if we change this little bit and this little bit. And it's the same as like editing an article, like you keep reading it and you keep editing until you get it to a point where you feel comfortable with. And then that also brings in like the transparency part, because I feel like especially in the zine area, that's something that people really relate to. So if you're very transparent with your audience and we're like, hey, like we're still growing, we're still evolving, like let us know what you guys think about this, people respond really well to editing and trial and error.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Cool. Does anyone else have any other questions? Otherwise, I'll keep going. I could have questions for Kyla for days. I guess I'd like to know a little bit about, because you mentioned, we talked about this before, it's, you know, you learn one thing in school about branding and marketing, then you learn from your own experiences. If someone is debating about going to school for this or even taking a class in this, would you recommend they just start their own project and learn from that end, or you think school does have some value to it?
Well, I think I would be very hypocritical if I said that I don't think school would have any value, because my major is arts technology and business innovation, and so a big part of that we learn is company branding and marketing, and so there's like always 100% of value in learning that in a more traditional sense, because I feel like that better equips you for learning the basics and then figuring out how to deconstruct that and how that works for you. And I definitely think though that the best way to learn about this sort of thing, especially if you're going from a more freelance, from a more like entrepreneurial and artistic side, is to go out there and do it yourself and figure out what works for you. Like I said, like deconstruct what you've been told, take the elements that work and build your own system from the ground up. Yeah.
That's awesome. We have a question in the comments asking, what's one of the most difficult things you've overcome from owning your own magazine?
I think one of the most difficult things, I'm not too sure if I've essentially overcome this quite yet, but I think I've more or less come to terms with it, is the fact that I think I was very much preaching to the choir when I said that with consistency with branding, it's okay to be inconsistent as long as you are like very honest about that and very consistent with that inconsistency, which seems like a bit of an oxymoron. Also, sorry, somebody's leaf blowing outside my room right now. But yeah, so that was one thing where I used to put a lot of pressure on myself to sort of, I guess, to be more consistent with my projects and my branding and making everything the same. And then I got into this space that I wasn't necessarily happy with. And it took me a moment to realize that a lot of that unhappiness came from putting myself in a box that I thought I had to be in, but really did not necessarily have to be in that, if that makes any sense. And that's still something that I struggle with all the time, because as a creative and a business person, you're told like consistency is like one of the biggest things. And I think that that's something that is true, but then we also have to, I guess, question how far that extends.
We'll go to Alex and then we'll go to Monique. Alex, do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes. Hi, everyone. So I had a question about, basically I have my own, I guess, zine, and I wanted to know like how you were able to kind of find and build a team, and did you start off like compensating them, or was it collaborative, and just like that whole process of like getting a team together?
Yeah, of course. So right now, Pure Nowhere has a team of around 70 individuals, which has been a fairly new ad just in the last year. And I think when building a team with a publication, one of the main things that I always like to emphasize is communication, transparency, and just letting people know that I never want magazine work to be something that people feel like they have to do or something that stresses them out. And I feel like that principle like keeps our team very engaged, keeps them coming back, keeps them just very open when they're like, hey, I have this going on, like I can't do this much work like for the next month or for the next week or however. And so it's really has to be like a back and forth communication. But for initially finding that team, honestly, the way that I did it was just reaching out to friends and spreading the word and telling people, hey, we're looking. Obviously putting it out there on Instagram, having any of like your artist friends repost it is super, super beneficial. And even smaller magazines, like a super good way to get new team members, because a lot of our team members also work on other publications and found us through other publications as well. And also keep in mind that team members will come and go. We've been doing this for around 5 years now, and I maybe have like 5 team members from like our original like team iteration sort of thing. So if that answers your question, it's like a nice ebb and flow, mostly word of mouth, and also reaching out to anybody who you think would be interested or anybody who you know would fit a job position very eloquently.
Thank you. That really helped.
Of course.
Well, we also got a question from Monique. Is it even worth having a Facebook presence anymore?
So I just hit my ring on my desk. I'm gonna be honest, I don't necessarily know how to use Facebook in terms of like creative marketing. That's something that I definitely tried to learn how to use a bit more in the beginning years of Pure Nowhere when I was like 15, 16, and there was a bit more of like a heavy emphasis on that as a small business. But I think right now, definitely with Instagram, with TikTok, with Twitter, Facebook is not necessary. And for the demographic that you're trying to hit as a young person, you won't find those audiences like in that area. But I do want to second what Birdie just said in the chat, that Facebook events are very helpful. So I think it kind of depends what you're using it for. I personally, however, don't really use Facebook that much for that.
Great. Also, we have a question from, I'm sorry if I butcher your name, Anale. Do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Yeah, I had a question that kind of stems off the question about building a team. How important would you think that personal branding and, you know, as a personal creative, how important would having your own brand, and do you think that with your team and the magazine that your whole team has a similar brand that coincides with the branding of your magazine, and how important that would be?
Yeah, so I think it sort of depends if you're starting out your magazine and already having like a vision for what you want to do independently. I know that at least for me, Pure Nowhere is a co-owned organization, so I'm only one half of it. My co-owner Abby does not have a personal brand as an artist because most of her creative work relies solely within Pure Nowhere, versus me, I really enjoy my freelance work. I enjoy branching out from Pure Nowhere, but I didn't establish a creative brand until like several years into my company. That was also just due to like age and not really knowing what I wanted to do and that sort of thing. But if you are really interested in freelance and growing your identity as a separate creative, I would say that it's not necessary, but it's super beneficial if you're looking to branch out. But then if you're super also very much into the publication that you're working with, your creative identity will also grow alongside that.
Thank you.
Of course.
Cool. I think this will be our last question from Selena. How can I promote and grow my Instagram as a small business?
Okay. Sorry if you heard the screenshot. I was just screenshotting some of your magazine ads in the chat. But how do you promote? You said your magazine as a small business on Instagram? Okay. On Instagram, I would definitely say that the biggest way that we grew our publication was through platform collaborations, like messaging photographers that you really admire or smaller photographers that you would love to shout out just because they're doing amazing work and you're really passionate about what they're doing. Always message them before you post any of their work, but just message them and be like, hey, like I run this publication, I think your work is incredible, like I would love to post some of this on my Instagram account with maybe like a small caption about what you do. And then through posting that, the artist almost always reposts it, and then you create a really productive narrative between you and this creative, and then it grows like a really nice word of mouth community network. So yeah, just interacting with as many people on Instagram as possible. And this is like moving off of Instagram, but TikTok has been a super huge asset when growing our publication, just because the algorithm is so specialized. So I would 100% recommend making a TikTok account, making just like playlist videos or like magazine flip throughs or like artist highlights sort of thing. Those do really well on there.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Kyla, so much. You're so full of wisdom. Everyone, please make sure to check out Pure Noah and Kyla if you haven't already. Also, I'm loving seeing all you guys put your Instagram at. So feel free to, if you run a magazine or are interested in that, feel free to put that in the chat. I guess we can do a little clap for Kyla again. And thank you again. And we are going to